What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about a new anime installment into the Lord of the Rings franchise, and that film is called The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim. Directed by Kenji Kamiyama, this film stars people like Gaia Wise, Brian Cox, Luca Pasqualino, Lorraine Ashbourne, Miranda Otto, and many more. Who would have thought that a Lord of the Rings anime film would ever come out? I can tell you it was not on my bingo card, and going into this film, I was pretty excited knowing that Peter Jackson, who directed, of course, the 6 films that he did before in this franchise, was going to be producing the film as well, and the fact that it was an anime. As a fan of the Lord of the Rings franchise and as a fan of anime, I was really excited to see this pretty big swing, because I think it really just allows these franchises to feel new and different in different mediums, in different styles, and I think that it's probably really exciting for people who are big fans of the Lord of the Rings, who also like anime, as well as people who may be big fans of anime who have never really gotten into the Lord of the Rings, but maybe this is their entryway in. I'll be really curious to hear what the general opinions of this film will be as time goes on, but before we get into my thoughts on the film, I want to say a big thanks to all of you guys for taking your time out of your day to listen to my review, and if you're new to the channel, I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing to the channel, as every week I have reviews that are up-to-date new movies, as well as things like early reviews for movies, TV shows, as well as retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog. And if you're a returning viewer, well, thanks so much for coming back and continuing to support the channel. So let's get into this. The War of the Rohirrim is a pretty straightforward story, and arguably might be one of the most straightforward stories that we've gotten in this franchise, especially on screen. And so with all that said, the film focuses on the character of Hera, played by Gaia Wise, who is the daughter to a king known as Helm, played by Brian Cox. We learn pretty quickly into the film that this king ended up wronging an individual named Wolf, who's part of another group of individuals, but they are under this king. This individual Wolf, played by Luca Pasqualino, ends up coming on a revenge warpath towards the king and all of his people, trying to take the throne. And what you have here is a very straightforward story of a king having to protect his kin, his people, his land, away from this other guy who is now trying to take over that, as well as having his own army. And you have these two armies clashing, and that is pretty much the general gist of this film. It's a pretty straightforward story, and in some ways it's almost the most simplistic and kind of easy to follow narrative in the world of the Lord of the Rings, because if you look at something like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the original trilogy, that is probably looked at as probably one of the most well-balanced stories, especially across 3 films, that has a lot of slow moments and the big moments, and the action is able to have character and heart and overarching narratives and all these different things and side plots and different themes that you can kind of connect to. This film is far more simplistic in comparison to that, but then you can look at something like The Rings of Power that maybe is criticized for having too many storylines going on. This is definitely the opposite of that, where it's a far more straightforward, simple revenge tale and a king having to protect his people. And in a lot of ways, I enjoyed that. I found that it made it kind of, this film have a bit of a fresher take to it. In some ways, I also think it held the film back compared to other things we've seen in this franchise. But what I can start this review out by saying is that I think the animation here is stunning. As a huge fan of anime, I like to always see the different styles of anime that we get, because not all anime are animated the same way. And in the modern day, where we see some pretty beautiful animated animations, it's also nice to be able to have something like this that feels like a modern anime while also feeling like it harkens to the past of anime, very much feeling like an animated film that would have come out in the genre in the early 2000s. I really like the overall aesthetic of this film, utilizing 3D backgrounds oftentimes with 2D individuals and characters and creatures that we're focusing on in the forefront of the story. I thought the action sequences in this film were brilliantly well done. There are so many sequences in this movie that were so much fun to watch, just because I really think anime allows for you to kind of have a greater sense of disbelief when it comes down to these big fantastical action sequences, allowing for a lot of the character movements and the kind of slowed down movie time to feel a lot more in tune with this genre. And I think that this film definitely was able to benefit from the things that make anime so cool when it comes down to visuals and action. So that's definitely where this film shines. Outside of that, I think the voice cast is really strong here. The main character we really center on here is the character of Hera, played by Gaia Wise, and I think she plays this really strong character. She's the one daughter in a group of 2 other brothers. Her king, her father, is super protective of her and oftentimes looks down on her, or at least that's what she thinks, only for her to really realize that she's incredibly cherished and ultimately a very strong character, making her a really strong heroine at the beginning and throughout the course of this film. I found a lot of the side characters to be incredibly likable as well throughout the course of the film, some of them leading into some great action sequences, while others leading into some nice comedic moments as well. I think the world of the Lord of the Rings, the Middle Earth world, is definitely present here, and it was nice to see all the little details in the animation that bring this world to life the same way that they do in the live action installments as well. And I think the other actors in here, like Brian Cox playing the father, King Helm, I thought he really brought an incredible performance here. I actually didn't even realize it was Brian Cox until after the movie was over, and I looked at who was in the film, which surprised me. I think he did a good job. Now that I hear it, I'm like, okay, that's definitely Brian Cox. But I think he did a great job of making me kind of think of him as this king character, more so than thinking, well, who's that voice? And I really have to praise him for that. The main villain of the film, Wolf, I think is a really cool character and concept. I like the look of the character. He's played by Luca Pasqualino, who I do think gives a really solid vocal performance here and definitely sells that revenge tale that this character is kind of motivated by. What I will say about his character, though, is that he's fairly frustrating a lot of times, being incredibly arrogant and in some ways becoming that generic bad guy that we've seen in a lot of films, who doesn't want to listen to anybody around him and is willing to see the men around him die in order for him to achieve his goal. We've seen this kind of villain time in and time out, so it's unfortunate that this character, by the time we get to the end, does feel like a pretty just arrogant, stupid, very generic villain. But I do think that he is able to give off menace and threat and does things in the narrative at times that definitely make you think, okay, well, this guy is definitely a maniacal bad guy, which I think is definitely to the film's benefit. With all that said, what I could say held this movie back for me a little bit was its oversimplicity, because I think the lack of maybe some side plots to just add a little bit more fluff to the film, not necessarily fluff, but a little bit more layers to the film is probably what I should say, kind of made this film feel just a little bit hollow in areas, because I think the first portion of this film and the last portion of this film are really solid, with that middle portion of the film being a little bit too slow, if you ask me. With that said, though, I think that those slow moments are still utilized to expand upon characters, and again are beautifully animated, so by no means was I ever like fully bored while watching it. There was just a part of me that thought to myself, all right, I don't feel as connected to the middle portion of this film as I did the beginning and end. Again, there are some important pieces to the story that are kind of being fleshed out there, especially around the character of Hera, so you do need that central portion of the film. I just do feel like maybe a couple of extra storylines or a couple of extra characters who are in the film that are enjoyable, maybe being given a little bit more to do, would have given this film just a little bit more meat on the bone that would have left me a little bit more satisfied by the time we got to the end. Because by the time we got to the end, what I could say about the film was that was a fun time. I found it to be really well animated. I thought it was very beautiful to look at. I thought the story was fun and the action sequences were really cool to see, but the story in some ways just felt so straightforward and generic that you saw where it was going and there wasn't this grand sense of surprise. There are some big surprises around certain characters, and most namely the king. I think that Brian Cox again gives a great performance here, but what they choose to do with his character I think is without a doubt the coolest. He's a badass character in the film. I really enjoyed him more than I thought he was going to, and I think that Hera is given a lot of great moments in the film as well. It's everybody else around them that I do think are intriguing, cool characters that I ultimately just didn't feel were given enough to do for this 2 hours and some change movie that ultimately could have had just a little bit more meat on the bones. Now, a question that many may have about this film though is, how does it connect to the bigger world of Middle Earth? Does it kind of connect to those things we want to see? And I'll say definitely. There's definitely a location that's spent a lot of time in this film that is integral to kind of building upon the lore of future installments in the franchise that I think is going to put a smile on a lot of people's faces. And the film definitely has a couple of its moments that feel like the obligatory, hey, you know that thing, hey, you remember this? Or hey, let's get you smiling for 2 seconds with this little hit and nod with this cameo, or let's mention that character that's going to put a smile on your face. Sometimes it felt a little bit cheap, but oftentimes I was like, all right, that was cool. It was nice to see or hear, whatever the case may be. For the most part, this film stands on its own, but it does have a couple of things that definitely roots it in the overall mythology of the Lord of the Rings franchise, which was undeniably cool to see as a big fan of the franchise. With all that said, I think the Lord of the Rings, the War of the Rohirrim, is a really good time. There's a lot of fun action to be had here. It's really cool to look at, and the story is straightforward and fun. It's easy to follow, and by no means is asking a lot of you. I just don't think it's necessarily as compelling or overall gripping as other installments that we've gotten in this franchise, nor is it as dense. When it comes down to the Lord of the Rings or a lot of other fantasy franchises, it tends to be kind of layered and dense with lore and character building and all kinds of side plots that all coalesce. And in the case of this film, it just didn't really have all that. It was a very straightforward story that's easy to follow, which makes it fun to watch, but ultimately left me desiring a little bit more on a character level. But again, still a fun time. A movie I would definitely see myself revisiting in the future and could possibly find myself enjoying more with every subsequent viewing. With all that said, I look forward to hearing what all of you guys have to say about it. Are you planning on checking out this new Lord of the Rings anime? Is it on your radar? Is it not on your radar? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.